Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I didn't plan on becoming the person who could point at a lodgepole pine and tell you if it would creak in the wind at 2 a.m. or which Forest Service spur road still had intact culverts after a washout. Before the outbreak, I was a radio technician for a utility company in Denver. My job was repeaters and antennas, climbing steel and listening to the quiet hiss of signal. When things started going wrong and the city spun with sirens and stalled traffic, a friend from Search and Rescue sent a short text. West, trees, bring tools. That was all. I left before the on-ramp cameras froze and the buses stopped in place on Colfax like chess pieces no one wanted to touch. The first night, I slept in the back of my Subaru in a pullout off CO67, the highway that runs from Sedalia to Woodland Park. I put the back seats down, laid my sleeping bag on top of a tool roll and a plastic tote of Coax connectors, and listened to wind wash up from the valley. The mountains have their own time, longer, slower seconds. As if the clock runs through sap instead of copper wire. I woke to a soft grey light, a pair of mule deer ghosting past the car, and the sound of distant helicopters that never came close. South of me was Deckers, and the broad ribbon of the South Platte. To the west, dirt roads braided out into the Pike National Forest, rough washboard and granite marbles under the tyres. I chose one that climbed and kept climbing. Rampart Range Road. Forest Road 300, long and dusty on maps and real life, and led the car onto the backbone of the hills. Our camp started as 2 vehicles and a tarp. By the end of the first week, we were a dozen people, a line of canvas between ponderosa trunks and a fire ring built with care far from low limbs. We set up in a saddle between ridges where the wind thinned the mosquitoes, and the afternoon storms broke harmlessly in veils of rain. Water came from a spring we found by accident, a clear trickle pooling in a rocky cup below a stand of willows. I set a Sawyer filter in line with vinyl tubing and a dry bag, and every evening I carried 10 litres up the hill. Listening for the soft, quick steps of animals, we built our shelter with paracord and patience, angled the tarps to shed the daily storm, and lined a trench with smooth stones to lead the water away. The first time one of us slept without waking to a rustle and grabbing for a flashlight, we celebrated with instant coffee and a handful of M&Ms someone had saved since the world still ran on schedules. We were from everywhere, but Colorado made a kind of sense of us. Mira had worked night shifts at UC Health in Aurora. She came with a small backpack of trauma supplies and the habit of checking your pulse with her eyes. Walt was an amateur radio operator from Castle Rock, with the call sign W0ALT, and a knack for building antennas out of fence wire and imagination. He brought a milk crate with an HF transceiver, a 12-volt battery, a scribbled notebook of frequencies, and a coil of RG8X that he cared for like a pet. Taryn had been a school bus driver in Douglas County and showed up behind the wheel of a yellow Type C. The shorter kind, with a 5.9 Cummins diesel and a rattle like a jar of bolts. She'd found it idling in a depot with the key still in the visor. Jonah had served 2 hitches in the army, then worked at a garage in Colorado Springs. He carried himself in a way that made space for others. His long gun was an AR-15 pattern rifle he kept in a plain case, nothing shiny, with a sling he had sewn from webbing, and a handful of 30-round magazines he treated like rare books. He didn't talk much about Fort Carson except to say the motor pool had been tidy. We learned our valley by foot, the map in my head stitched together quickly. To the east, the Front Range dropped toward the plain. To the west, granite rolled into higher country where late snow lingered in couloirs. Our dirt road, FR 300, crossed other spurs. FR 507 to a saddle with a view down into Manitou Park, FR 322 to a cluster of old campsites, FR 507A that showed up on no sign but wore the tracks of old logging trucks like scar tissue. On day 5, We walked a mile to a knoll and found an old Forest Service equipment yard. The chain-link gate had sagged and one hinge snapped. Inside were treasures we never expected this soon. A bundle of picket posts, a rusty survey tripod, coil after coil of rope, and a ring of boulder baskets wired with heavy gauge mesh. There was an office shed with a faded USFS emblem where we found a laminated map of the district and an emergency kit with a satchel of burn dressings and a hand crank radio whose solar panel still worked. We rolled the boulder baskets up the road and used them as anchors for our tarps. We took only what we needed and left a note in case someone else was tracking us on paper. Using this site for temporary shelter, water source up trail, no harm meant. People at FR 300 saddle. We didn't take it personally when we heard the first infected moving in the timber. The forest is never silent. Squirrels bark, birds scold, and deer move like soft punctuation in the understory. The infected were different, staccato and unsure, sometimes still, sometimes erratic, drawn to human sound like moths to a porch light. We set rules the way healthy groups do. No shouting, no rapid running near camp. Tools laid down on padded cloth, and cooking during mid-afternoon when wind swallowed sound. At night, we hung wind chimes in the tree line made from tent stakes and old keys. If the wind blew, we heard them in gentle bursts and slept. If something walked through them, the notes became patterns. Walt set a perimeter radio on Vox with its squelch tuned to break on unusual noise. It would hiss softly when the chime sang at the wrong hour. The first time it hissed at 3 a.m, Jonah went to one knee and Mira put her palm on my shoulder as if we were at the edge of a hospital bed. We watched faint shapes pause beyond the chimes and turn toward a faraway howl from the road. Our camp breathed again. Food governed our days. We had what we carried: oats, rice, pouches of tuna, beans, a case of peanut butter jars that made everyone grateful to whoever stocked the pantry where Taryn had found them. We set figure-4 traps and deadfalls, not for anything larger than chipmunks. None of us wanted to attract a bear, but as practice. When we found a small meadow with a dozen young aspen, we set lines with lightweight hooks in a brook that ran through stones like a nervous thread. Brook trout rose like a curtain pulled by small hands. Kira, a Forest Service hydrologist who had hiked in from the west after camping alone near Tariel Creek, showed us how to look for aquatic insects on river rocks and where undercut banks might hold a fish, even in the bright hours. We cooked with a small stove under the tarp. The smell pulled downhill, kept clean to keep visitors with sharp noses away. We counted calories without speaking the number. I built the radios. In the afternoons, after the storms, and before the long light, I unrolled cokes and tuned antennas with an SWR meter until the needle curled sweetly low. Walt and I lifted a half-wave wire for 40 meters between two pines and hung a counterpoise in the brush. We tuned into a net that used to meet every Thursday night and found it still meeting. Voices thinner, check-ins shorter. We heard a sheriff's unit from Fremont County repeating instructions that didn't match reality anymore. Report to established aid stations. Wait for state guidance. We heard a scratchy voice that might have been a park ranger near Lake George giving weather. A woman in Grand Junction calling for anyone with insulin. And at least once, someone repeating an emergency traffic pattern on 2 meters in a rhythmic voice like a mantra. Walt kept a paper log. We didn't broadcast much during those first days. You can learn a lot by only listening. On the 9th day, we made our first serious run for supplies. The bus had range and storage and good ground clearance. Jonah pre-checked it like a flight crew chief. Belts, fluids, a quick look under the chassis for loose lines. Taryn drove with her palms relaxed at 10 and 2, the way professionals do when they want to feel the road. I sat behind her with a short list and a long set of maybes. Mira took the rear corner with a backpack of medical supplies and a calm voice. We agreed on Woodland Park for fuel and whatever we could find. Hardware, a grocer, maybe a sporting goods rack if anything was left. The bus coughed once and then took the grade like the stubborn steel pixel it was. CO67 into town showed the quiet version of a disaster. The road carried the memory of traffic in black glassy arcs of rubber, the edges scuffed where tires had turned without moving forward. A scattering of vehicles sat in odd places, their hazard lights long dead. In the middle distance, we saw motion we didn't want to trigger. Taryn threaded us through with the care of someone backing a boat down a narrow ramp. At the edge of town, we stopped at a fuel station with a generator-sized mute silence, where the pumps would have hummed. The power, of course, was out. Jonah tapped a pump casing with his knuckle and then shook his head. Without electricity, it was just a steel totem. We tried the hardware store next, one of those family-run places where every pegboard hook is labelled in Sharpie. The front door was locked. A handwritten sign said, "Back in 5." Jonah eased the pry bar from his belt and looked at each of us. Taryn nodded and Mira touched the sign with 2 fingers before we moved it aside. We entered quiet, called out our names and our purpose, waited. Inside, the air smelled like cedar hangers and spilled fertilizer. We took work gloves, a handsaw, a folding shovel, hose clamps, bungee cords, and a second water filter to keep Mira's hands free in camp. At the register, we left a note with our names and a promise to make it right when there was someone to make it right to. That kind of accounting mattered to us. It wasn't about debt. It was about the kind of people we wanted to stay. We found a small grocery where freezers had started to sweat. We took shelf-stable items and left anything that would draw attention with smell. A sporting goods rack in the back still held a few useful items. 2 boxes of 9x19mm, a tin of .22 LR hollow points, and a threadbare sling that Jonah rejected with a single glance. He preferred his webbing. I found a hand-crank LED lantern that worked and a box of stormproof matches in a metal tin stamped with a mountain range. In the pharmacy aisle, Mira moved with purpose, selecting gauze, antiseptic, OTC pain relievers, antihistamines, and electrolyte packets. She stared a long time at the empty shelf where insulin would have been, and then placed 2 boxes of glucometer strips in her pack anyway. Out in the bus, the day had turned to that flat, white brightness that means storms are building over Pike's Peak. On our way out of town, we passed the high school. It looked the way schools always look in summer, sleepy, the bleachers empty, the flag still. Only the silence was too thick. Taryn stared through the fence and then blinked and gripped the wheel a little firmer. At the last bend before the forest, we saw a group of people at the edge of a subdivision, standing very still, facing the same way as if listening to an invisible PA system. We didn't make eye contact. Taryn kept the engine steady. The bus hummed and we rolled back into the trees. Camp changed when the bus came back heavy and the list shorter. The act of stocking shelves turns people into a town. We built a pantry from pallets and bins. We designated a warming shelter that could be made smokeless by using a small backpacking stove under a high tarp during snow. We rotated people through tasks without ever writing them on a board. Water duty, kitchen, perimeter, radio, tools. Walt found a rhythm in the late morning where he could raise voices from the western slope. I got the 2-meter Yagi up on the tripod we'd found. With a little duct tape and finesse, it turned smoothly enough to touch repeaters in Colorado Springs and beyond. We kept transmissions short, used call signs when we remembered, and otherwise spoke in plain words. Where we were, what we had, what we needed, what we could offer. A week later, a new voice reached us. "This is Shady Brook Base standing by." It was clear, the kind of audio that makes your head lift without you choosing. Shady Brook is a YMCA camp tucked into the pines not far from Decker's, with cabins and a dining hall and a lake the colour of bottle glass on cloudy days. The voice belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Director Leslie. She said they had kids' bunk beds, a commercial kitchen, a well with a pump house that ran off a generator, and a lot of questions. They had a small group, mostly staff who had stayed when closures hit, plus a few families who had arrived early for a program that never started. They needed medicine, hand tools, and advice about perimeter security. We needed a place to anchor to that wasn't just tarps and hope. The map in my head rearranged itself. The road to Shady Brook is part paved, part gravel, the kind of route where locals wave and everyone else slows to look for a turn they've missed. We took the bus for capacity and my Subaru as a scout, with Mira in the front passenger seat calling out what she saw and Jonah in the back watching mirrors. Walt stayed at camp with Kira. They had a schedule to keep with the spring and the filters and the radio net. Taryn parked the bus in a wide turnout beneath a stand of Douglas fir. I drove the last mile with my window down, listening to the sound the world makes when it holds its breath. Leslie met us at the front gate with a clipboard she no longer needed but still held. She was late 30s, early 40s, sunline at the corner of her eyes, the kind of person who learns everyone's names in one pass and remembers them a year later. The camp sat open like a book, cabins with porches, a low dining hall with flags from different countries hanging inside, a field where the grass had grown knee-high and gone to seed. The well house hummed, the generator in a small shed beside it, with intake vents that someone had wisely covered with hardware cloth. On the ridge above, a zip line ran between poles like a strange sculpture. The place had been built to hold kids safely, and then the world changed, and it was trying to remember how to hold anyone at all. We walked the perimeter together. Jonah counted with his eyes and pointed with his chin. A fence is a suggestion to wildlife and a nudge to people. The strongest boundary here would be distance and how quietly we lived inside it. We suggested moving the main entrance bar across the drive at night and parking a heavy vehicle behind it at an angle. We showed them our wind chimes trick and left a bag of spare tent stakes and cord. We helped them cut branches back from cabin roofs to lower fire risk. Anyone who has lived through a front range summer knows that lightning is the real king. In the kitchen, Mira inventoried coolers and showed a few of the families how to turn the commercial stove into a warm space without too much scent. I checked the pump house and ran my hand over the generator casing. They had fuel, but not much. We left them a portion of ours and a promise. In return, they offered us something no hardware store could stock: community. A camp like Shady Brook wasn't just buildings, it was the pattern of work and rest. Bells and mealtimes, clean-up songs still taped to the wall. Leslie had a whiteboard in her office with names and availability that she updated with a dry erase marker, even when no one stood there to watch. She asked if we wanted to move in. We didn't want to move in anywhere forever, but we did start spending days there, fixing and teaching and learning how to be around more people again. Nights, we went back to our saddle camp. The tall pines, the tarps, the way the sky turned saturated after a storm. Summer settled in like a long exhale. The afternoon thunderstorms were short and strong. We watched Virga, rain that falls and evaporates, hang like torn curtains over Pike's Peak. The camp's routine turned our days into repeatable things. Morning, boil water, coffee, review plan. Late morning, projects. Afternoon, quiet hours when heat makes noise travel and lightning makes you count seconds. Evening, radio, small chores, music from someone's phone speaker low enough that only the nearest person heard it. At Shady Brook, kids made soccer balls out of duct tape and scraps of foam and tried to remember what it felt like to play without looking over their shoulders. At our saddle camp, I set up a small mast and hung a VHF Slim Jim in a pine, fed by ladder line that sounded like wind chimes when the breeze hit. Walt taught Kira and Taryn how to call CQ with a voice that carried but didn't strain. We heard voices from Idaho Springs, Fairplay, occasionally even Fort Collins when the layer was right. News, such as it was, arrived as fragments. The interstate had choke points that remained impassable. A hospital in Colorado Springs was running a skeleton operation for anyone who could make it to the ER doors and be triaged without chaos. A group north of us near West Creek was building a small farm using drip irrigation and shade cloth. Some communities had instituted quiet hours after dusk to keep night hearing clean. State messages were brief and careful. The official channels avoided the word zombie, and so did we. In camp, we said infected or affected. It mattered less what we called it than what we did in response. Stay aware, keep it simple, be kind. One evening, A brush fire started southwest of us, just a few acres in grass and low shrubs where lightning had struck. We smelled it before we saw it, the warm, dusty, mineral scent that means something is smoking on a slope. Kira raised her head like a deer. We hiked to a little knoll and watched a thin brown column lift. The wind was in our favor, pushing it away, but wind is fickle. We tightened our camp. Water jugs topped off, go bags by the vehicles, tarps ready to drop if embers came. A volunteer engine from a nearby community rattled by on the road below. 3 people in yellow Nomex and hard hats, the pump chugging. They set a line quickly and held it to black. When we heard their radio, handheld on simple simplex, we passed a quick burst of weather from our net. Wind direction, gust speed, RH percentage from a station Walt had brought to life on the table with a tiny tumble cup anemometer. "Copy," they said, and then very human. "Thanks." Not everything was tidy. Late July brought a night that tested our shape. The day had been clear, the sky a kind of unreasonable blue you can only get at 8,000 feet. I had finished checking the coax connections when the wind chimes gave a pattern I had never heard before. It wasn't random. It was a steady, cautious brush, like fingertips moving slowly on metal. Jonah moved to the edge of the tarp and put a finger to his lips. He carried a headlamp in his pocket that he kept angled low. He flicked it on briefly. In its circle stood a young man, maybe 20, in a faded Broncos hoodie, his face empty with the wrong kind of pause. He tilted his head at us. Behind him, 6 others stood, equally still. They moved when he moved, as if tethered by invisible thread. We didn't shout. Jonah lifted his hands to show open palms and stepped back. The young man stepped forward, toes brushing the line of our chimes, and then stopped at the soft clink. He turned his face to the sound, held it there, then returned to his former angle like a compass needle. It felt like watching someone try to remember a word and then stop trying. For several long minutes, we stood, barely breathing, while the group's attention drifted toward a faint sound far down the slope, the echo of a vehicle we could not see. They turned, one by one. We stayed still until they blended into the firs. When our shoulders dropped, I realized my hands were shaking as if cold. Mira touched the inside of my wrist the way she did with anyone who needed steadying. No words, just contact. We adjusted. We lifted our wind chimes higher and set an outer ring lower that would catch a shin. We practiced the quiet version of evacuation. No slamming doors, no raised voices. Gear organized so it could be lifted and carried in one pass. We set rally points not only at the vehicles, but also at a boulder outcrop 100 yards downslope, just in case. Shady Brook practiced too. Leslie ran a drill with her newest families. If an alarm sounded, each cabin leader counted. Each child paired hands. Everyone met at the dining hall's side door and waited for the next instruction. The world had shifted, but structure still worked. At night, I could picture the camp like a diagram, nodes and lines, and it made sleep possible. August crept in with heat and a growing sense that we were not the only ones building clusters of normal. A man named Silas reached us over 2 meters from a CDOT equipment yard near the intersection of CO24 and US 285. He had been a traffic engineer before, the kind of person who could bring up camera feeds of every bridge at once and tell you which lanes were just sticky with rubber and which needed clearing. Now he had a forklift, an office with a wall of keys, and a plan to unspool safety cones along a 1/4 mile of highway to make a path for emergency vehicles. He asked if anyone had diesel to spare and offered in return to open a parts cage for us. Belts, bearings, grease, all the things that keep a place humming. We met him halfway at a crossroads, each of us cautious but hopeful. Jonah checked hands and faces the way he always did, looking for intent, not appearance. Silas wore a hard hat with a crack that ran like a lightning bolt from brim to crown and smiled like he meant it. He traded us 2 new belts for the bus, 3 gallons of diesel and a stack of flares. We traded him a box of long-lasting light sticks for lane marking and a bag of coffee he cupped in his hands, like it might make more of itself. One afternoon, the sky went from clear to a grey with a green cast, and the air took on that weird metallic taste that means hail. We got everyone under cover, pulled the tarps tight, put pads under the radio gear. The first stones were small as peas, then bigger, hitting the tarp with a sound like hands clapping. When it was over, the ground steamed. We walked our perimeter, checked for torn fabric or downed lines, and found only one casualty. The glass face of a small solar light cracked like a spider web. We replaced it with a headlamp rigged to a recycled pickle jar and called it good. Outdoors work makes you inventive or miserable, and we chose inventive every time we could. We started teaching each other. Mira ran a 1-hour clinic on wound cleaning and bandaging with kids' stuffed animals as practice patients. Jonah taught a class on vehicle checks and basic mechanics. How to check fluid levels, what a healthy belt looks like, how to listen to an engine at idle. Walt taught radio basics, what a call sign means, how to say over when you finish, why you don't tie up a frequency with chatter when others might need to break in. Kira walked us to creeks and pointed at undercut banks and riffles and said, "That's a fish's living room," and you could imagine their small purposeful lives. I taught what I could about antennas, about how a line hung high between trees can touch a voice you can't see. Even Taryn, who joked that she only knew how to take a curve without the kids shifting on the bench seats, taught a class in steady hands. How to keep your breath low and the wheel easy so people behind you feel safe. As fall hinted at the edges of mornings, we faced a choice. We could winterize the saddle camp and ride out snow squalls under tarps and in our vehicles, or we could start moving tools and truss to roofs. Shady Brook made the choice easier by offering us a row of cabins that faced south to drink in the weak winter sun. We strafed our world slowly. The pantry first, then the tools, then the radio gear. We kept the saddle camp alive as our high place, a lookout, a point on a map we could return to if anything changed. We left it tidy, as if we were stepping out for a short errand. The first night sleeping in a room with wood walls felt strange after months of trees. I lay in a bunk and listened to the building crack softly as it cooled, then to the long hiss of a distant pine in the wind, and then, finally, to nothing at all. Winter in Colorado, at elevation, is not a theatre that opens with trumpets. It moves in piece by piece, a dusting that doesn't stick, a ridge of frost that hangs around in the shade past noon. The first morning your breath looks like you're carrying a small cloud in your mouth. We cut firewood, but burned sparingly, using small hot fires that left little smoke. We cooked inside the dining hall with fans on low to push smell up and out. We kept walkways clear with snow shovels that had bent handles and a stubborn streak. Kids learned to slide on their boots and fall correctly without turning ankles. We sealed cracks with foam and tape. In the pump house, the generator wore a blanket of moving blankets and optimism. When it was very cold, we shut it down by schedule and covered the wellhead with straw and a tarp, like tucking in a sleeping animal. The infected didn't do well in deep cold if they were out in it. Their movements slowed. We adjusted our watch hours to dawn and dusk when any living thing moves if can. A mountain lion cut tracks across our field one morning, and for a week we kept kids inside before breakfast. The lion passed through, as they do, a quiet shadow with a purpose that wasn't us. We traded with Silas for sand and spread it on the steep parts of the camp road when the sun glazed them to ribbons. People got better at falling in a friendly way. We laughed more often, the kind of laughter that lifts a group and carries it to the next task. Then, in January, a broadcast found us. It was on HF, lower band. A steady, strong signal that Walt and I both sat up for at the same time. A man's voice, calm, a little weary, announced a coordinated effort to map safe corridors across the state for spring movement. The call sign indicated a station near Fort Collins. They had fuel depots in mind, staffed by volunteers, where small caravans could refuel and receive updates. No central authority, just people agreeing to be useful. They needed relay stations. Walt looked at me and smiled in a way that felt like finding a good tool in a drawer you thought was empty. Our camp could be one. We had a generator, an antenna line, people who knew how to speak and listen. We checked in. We said our campsite name, Shady Saddle, a mashup that made kids giggle, and our capabilities. The voice thanked us and asked us to hold for instructions. For the first time in a long time, I felt the click of something larger turning and pointing our way. Spring in the foothills is a mud season, the time when boots get 2 inches taller and the creek tries to claim the road. We added a gravel skirt to the lower driveway with Silas's help, spread with shovels and a borrowed rake. The kids made jump ropes from paracord and learned the song the older ones taught them. Birds returned that I had learned by sound without ever having seen them. The piercing whistle of a Townsend solitaire. The scratchy trill of a junco in the brush. The first day we ate something green we didn't pull out of a packet, people applauded. It was a handful of nettle tops from a patch Kira found by a seep, blanched and stirred into rice like some expensive herb. Flavour returned to the world. The Corridors project asked for a lot. Observations, notes, relay checks, weather. We volunteers formed a net at scheduled times, avoided clogging frequencies with chatter, sent short bursts of useful info during the windows when propagation favoured us. We posted a simple sheet in the dining hall. If you hear this, write it down, with columns for time, frequency, station, message. We taught 3 people who had never touched a radio how to pass traffic. I rigged a small solar array on the south-facing roof to keep the station battery topped up. Jonah built a lockable cabinet for the gear out of reclaimed shelves and a padlock whose key we stashed in 3 places. The system worked. The first time a caravan reported refueling safely because a relay had alerted them to a blocked pass, we clapped like kids at a fireworks show. Not all news was good. A group in the city tried to hold a grocery warehouse and ended up leaving when the place drew more attention than it could survive. A community up near Conifer had a run-in with a band that wasn't interested in cooperation. We noted those reports carefully, not to fix them, we couldn't, but to know where to send people and where to caution them. A town east of Colorado Springs organized weekly markets, where people traded goods and skills in a sheltered lot, no currency needed, and built a bell system for alarms that rang different patterns depending on the need. We copied that idea, more or less, at Shady Brook. 3 short rings for weather, a long steady ring for drill, a broken pattern if anyone needed quiet help. It wasn't hard to teach. Kids learn patterns fast and grown-ups follow. The next test came not with sound but with silence. May delivered a 3-day period where the radios went weird, signals muffled, skip unpredictable, familiar nets thin or absent. It could have been sunspots or something we didn't understand. It reminded us that even our most careful systems rode on waves we could neither shape nor truly predict. We went to ground, kept our routines, conserved fuel, and waited. On the 4th day, a voice we knew came back, as if it had been behind a curtain that finally lifted. Shady Saddle, this is Fort Collins Base. We lost you there, reading you now. I felt something unclench in my chest that had tightened without my permission. Through all of it, there were small, human things that made the days belong to us. The kids painted a mural on a plywood sheet, pines, a mountain, a crooked sun, a river that looked like a bright ribbon. Taryn taught them how to check the bus oil, and they turned it into a ceremony with a paper hat for the designated inspector. Mira found a way to make pancakes with powdered milk, and we celebrated a birthday with syrup. Jonah fixed a broken hinge on a cabin door in a way that made it swing silently and took as much pleasure in that quiet as I did in tuning an antenna to the point where it met the sky without waste. Kira and I started walking the same loop in the early evenings, 1.5 miles through the trees, where the path widened and narrowed like a breath. We checked animal tracks and the way the creek's pattern changed after rain. We didn't talk about before. We didn't need to. Eventually, we needed to scout a corridor of our own. The map called it a spur, a way to connect CO67 to a series of dirt routes that would let small vehicles avoid the choke points near town We chose a morning with high clouds and a promise of an afternoon storm we intended to beat. Jonah drove the Subaru. I navigated. We brought a handsaw, a recovery strap, a first aid kit, and a small cooler with water and snacks in packs. The road started easy, 2 tracks with grass between, and then pinched to pass between boulders that had tumbled who knows how many winters ago. We found a place where a culvert had failed, and the road dropped half a tire's width into a muddy cut. We got out, scouted, stacked flat rocks and a few logs to dress the edge, and idled across with no drama. A mile later, the tracks rejoined a wider forest road, and the forest stepped back like it approved. We made notes, corridor marked. On the way back, we saw a plume of dust on the road ahead. We stopped, pulled to the side carefully, and watched as 2 vehicles approached, an older Tacoma and a small SUV packed high. They slowed when they saw us. The driver of the truck leaned out, a woman with grey hair pulled tight and eyes that missed nothing. "You folks setting a route?" she asked, not unkindly. "Trying to," Jonah said. "Aim is to keep people from getting stuck where they don't need to be." She nodded. "Heading for a place with cabins," she said. Heard a voice that said there was calm there. She meant Shady Brook without saying it. We told her the way. She looked at the sky, then at us. "You decent people?" she asked finally. It wasn't a rhetorical question anymore. Not in this world. "We try to be," I said. "We keep it quiet, and we share what we have when we can." She considered that, and then gave a single nod, like when you gently kick a tire and feel it isn't going to fool you today. "All right, see you on the radio," she said. They moved on, the dust from their tires hanging in the trees like faint gauze. There were hard days we don't put on a wall, but we don't hide from them either. A child ran a fever for a night that felt like a week. Amira paced like the tide with a cool cloth and soft words until it broke. A man who had joined us late left in the night with a pack of canned goods, and we never saw him again. We tightened our food storage and didn't tighten our hearts. A storm took down a pine that hit a cabin roof with a sound like a struck bell. No one inside was hurt. We measured the fall line and moved sleeping spaces to safer zones out of habit we kept because it pays. By the second summer, the camp felt like a small town in a book you keep rereading because you like how the people talk to each other. Gardens sprouted in repurposed bins using imported soil, and compost we had tended meticulously under a screen to keep animals away. We had kale and chard, and the kind of lettuce that tastes like water in the best way. Someone traded us seed potatoes in exchange for a full tank on their ham radio battery, and we planted them with the solemnity of a ceremony. Kids took on chores and then corrected adults who cut corners. Walt took on an apprentice who learned to write in block letters in the log and underline things that mattered. Jonah started a small class in situational awareness and invited everyone to bring their questions. No bravado, no bravura. People showed up. We didn't treat our safety like magic. We maintained it the way you maintain a truck. Checks, adjustments, quiet confidence. When we trained with tools that could defend us, a shotgun for perimeter, a carbine for the road, we did it with a focus on safety and necessity, never spectacle. Targets were paper or steel. Commands were simple. Muzzles stayed pointed where they should. We cleaned and stored tools like the serious things they were. We reinforced to kids that these were adult responsibilities for rare situations, not toys and not mysteries. We repeatedly chose not to go looking for trouble, and found that to be one of the most powerful choices of all. There were moments too, when the place felt almost too beautiful to match the facts of the world beyond it. A late afternoon, when the light went honey warm and the kids kicked a soccer ball made of duct tape, while someone played a guitar and tried to remember the words to an old song. A morning when mist lifted out of the trees like breath and left droplets on spiderwebs that made small pearls on a bracelet. A night when the Milky Way spread across the sky like someone had spilled salt from one horizon to another, and even the most restless among us felt still. We never forgot the infected were there. We kept our senses, wind chimes, trip lines, habits, alive. We helped newcomers learn the quiet walk. the way to step on the edge of the trail where duff is thickest, the way to hold a door so it doesn't slap. We tuned our voices to carry to the person we meant to reach and no further. Our watches accounted for the phases of the moon. During a new moon, we tightened routines. During a full one, we allowed a little more evening light and a few extra stories. The infected were like weather. You can hate the rain all you want, but it does not change that you need a roof and a good coat. When the corridors project announced that a route west had opened, slow but possible, past Lake George and on toward Buena Vista by weaving dirt roads and crossing meadows, we sent a team to scout. Not a conquest, not a migration, just a look. Taryn drove the bus as far as the route would allow, and we camped a night under a high ceiling of stars near a creek with a name I never learned. We met a group travelling east with 2 horses and a small cart, and we traded apples for oats, and both sides felt rich. In the morning, frost rimed the grass, and our breath hung in clouds until the sun found us. We returned not because we had to, but because we wanted to. Home was now a ring of pines and a set of routines that added up to a life. I think about the first text a lot. West, trees, bring tools. It was either luck or something like it that the message reached me before the towers went quiet. But it was not luck that turned a tarp and 2 vehicles into a camp and then a community. That took work, and better than work. It took the decision to be decent in ways that don't earn applause on any day, but the one you need them. The forest didn't save us. We saved each other in the forest, with the forest adding its patient, tall presence to the list of things that steadied us. Sometimes we still climb to the saddle in the blue hour before dawn. We leave the cabins quiet, step by step, and move up the old road by memory. The wind chimes there still hang, a little tarnished, strings replaced. We sit on the boulder where the view opens and watch the line where night becomes morning. You can see Pike's Peak start to gather light like a person putting on a coat. If the radios are up, we hear distant check-ins as teams across the state drink their first coffee and say, "Standing by." We answer, and in that small, clear act, we are part of a net that stretches across more than miles. We don't know what the world will look like 5 summers from now, but we have calendars again. Hand-drawn, sure, but with seasons marked and chores rotated, and birthdays circled with a line of colour scavenged from a box of worn-down pencils. We put notches on door frames where kids measure their height, and we mark the day the first strawberry ripened, and we cut it into eighths to share. Our tools are still our tools, saws and shovels, radios and ropes, a careful carbine cleaned and stored, a bus whose engine cough we understand better than most mechanics. Our rules still fit in a handful. Keep it quiet, keep it kind, keep it simple, keep watch for each other. One evening, near a year and a half after we strung the first tarp, a storm rolled in late. The sky went from clear to pewter, then to something like slate, and thunder walked across the ridge with slow, certain steps. We secured the lines, ducked into the dining hall, and listened to rain thrash the roof. The kids counted between flash and sound and called out the numbers 5, 7, 3, 9. On the radio table, the HF set hissed and popped as the atmosphere played tricks. Then, out of the static, a voice came through, clean and warm, from a station we had never heard before. "Shady Saddle, this is Alpine Ridge Station. We hear you're good people," the voice said. "We have a question about a culvert up near your corridor and a proposal about a shared watch." We looked at each other, wet hair dripping, hands on mugs, fatigue written in the kind of lines you earn honestly. Jonah smiled first, that slight lift that makes his eyes kind. I keyed the mic and gave our call. "Alpine Ridge, we're listening," I said. And we were. All of us. Not just to the voice on the air, but to the whole forest breathing. To the weather organising itself into an evening. To the shape of a future that wasn't guaranteed but felt, finally, possible. When the rain ended, and the world smelled like clean stone and pine, we stepped outside together. The path confirmed what we already felt. footprints in both directions, coming and going, a sign that nothing we built would ever be only ours. And that was the point. The wind chimes sang once, softly, and then settled. Someone started a kettle. Someone checked the perimeter. Someone made a note in the log. We chose our places under the tall, quiet trees, and as the light drained off the ridge, the camp glowed the way a safe place does when night begins. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.